One of the really nice things about working with Illustrator is that it is possible to modify the appearance of graphs and charts without having to ungroup them or breaking them apart. Now, we've already seen that you have the ability to change colors of bars and lines, for example, but Illustrator also has a feature called a graph design that allows you to take a certain part of a graph and replace it with a graphic that's far more complex than what Illustrator uses by default. So for example, if I take a look at these two charts right here in this file called Design01, I have a simple line chart, and each of the data points are represented by these little rectangles here. And I also have a bar chart or a column chart here, and again, simple basic rectangles represent the amount of data here. Now what I can do is define something as a graph design. In doing so, I will have later the ability to replace these basic objects like squares and rectangles with the ones that I define as a design. Now in this case here, say this chart was something about solar energy, and this was something about electricity. I can replace these plain little simple boxes with, for example, the image of a sun. Or I could take these simple columns here and replace them with something that looks like a battery. We'll also have several options that we can explore within each of these settings. So the first thing we need to do is to actually define a graph design. So first, let's talk about working with a line chart. Now yes, we know that by default, Illustrator uses these little squares to represent the data points on that graph. The official name for these little boxes is something called a marker. So what I can do is I can define a graph design, and then later I could tell Illustrator to use that graph design in place of the markers. We already know that these are called columns, so later on we'll be able to replace the columns with a specific graph design as well. So first, let's focus on how to actually define a graphic that I want to use as a marker. I'm going to start by switching to my direct selection tool, and I'm going to Option or Alt click on one of these little squares. I'm going to copy it and paste it over here. Let me move it right down about over here. The reason why I'm doing this is because Illustrator internally will always use that little rectangle or that little square as the marker. But what I can do is I can create a piece of artwork that will appear on top of that. This marker will always appear at this size, so whatever size that I use for my artwork simply needs to be in proportion to that square. So for example, if I were to take this sun as it is right now, you can see it's much larger than this box, which means that when I use it as a marker, I'm going to get a really large graphic. I don't really want it to be that big, so I'm going to select this sun graphic right here, and I'm simply going to resize it down to be a little smaller, say about that big. Next, I'm going to take this rectangle right here and select it, and I need to fill it with none, and I need to set its stroke to none as well. If you've ever worked with defining a pattern inside of Illustrator, you know that the backmost object of a repeat is usually a no-fill, no-stroke rectangle. So now that I have that rectangle with no fill and no stroke created, I'm also going to hold down the Shift key and select the sun graphic. So now both of these are selected, and I also want to go ahead and center them both upon each other. So I'm going to click a second time on the sun. That's going to define the sun as a key object, meaning the sun won't move, but just this square is going to move to the center of the sun here. I'll go to the Align panel, and I'll choose Horizontal Align Center and also Vertical Align Center. Now I am going to zoom in a lot closer here, and I'm going to click on the sun because I want to make sure that the sun is going to be at the top of my stacking order. Remember, that rectangle that I created there that has no fill and no stroke has to be the bottommost object in my selection. So I'm going to go to the Object menu, I'm going to choose Arrange, and then I'm going to choose Bring to Front. Okay. I'm now going to go ahead and marquee select both of these objects. You can see here that the no fill, no stroke rectangle is selected, and it is indeed behind the sun. Now I'm going to go to the Object menu, scroll down to where it says Graph, and I'm going to choose Design because I want to now define this as a design. I'm going to choose to create a new design, and now I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call this one Marker Sun. I'm going to click OK. So now if I click OK, I've successfully defined that design. Let's zoom out here and let's focus now on the column. So I want to define this piece of artwork as a design that I can use for a column. Now before I do that, I just want to point out that there are several ways to make a column work. In a chart, let's say I want to replace these graphics here, these regular plain boxes or rectangles with the battery. Well, how's that going to happen? I can set it so that the battery simply repeats itself multiple times. So for example, I'm just going to take this and just create a copy of it. And I may have multiple batteries stacked on top of each other to indicate how high each of these columns are. But I'm going to press undo here for a second, Command Z or Control Z, because there also is a way for you to create something called a sliding graph design. Basically, I can indicate to Illustrator where I want this piece of graphic to actually stretch. And that way, it will stretch without kind of adjusting or changing the proportions of this piece of artwork. Because I don't want to actually take this piece of artwork and simply stretch it so that everything looks distorted. That would be bad. But I could determine a certain area where Illustrator should basically expand or kind of stretch the design. So the way that I do that is I actually create a line which I turn into a guide. So I'm going to take my regular line tool here, and I'm going to start, let's say, right about over here, click and drag with the Shift key to right about over here. So I've created a line, and it's right here kind of towards the bottom part of the graphic, and I'm going to press Command 5 or Control 5, which is the keyboard shortcut to turn artwork into a guide. If I deselect it right now, you'll see that I've now created that guide. Now, you also have to make sure when we're about to define this as a design that I need to make sure that my guides are not locked. I can do that by just right-clicking on a blank area and making sure that Lock Guides is not checked. Alternatively, you can go to the View menu, go down to where it says Guides, and again, make sure that Lock Guides is not checked. Now what I can do is I can select this piece of artwork, and I can go up to the Object menu, go back to Graph, and then Design, and choose to define a new design. I'm going to rename it, and I'll call this one Column Battery. Now I'm going to click OK, and then once again click OK. And I've been able to successfully now define two graph designs inside this document. One for the sun, which I'm going to use as a marker. One for the battery, which I'm going to use as a column design. I'm going to go ahead now and save this document. I'm going to choose File, Save As. And I'll call this one Design 02. Click Save, and then click OK. And in the next movie, we're actually going to apply these designs to the graphs that appear in this document.